The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD is one of those huge turning points in history. It's a date that feels like a clean break from the ancient world, the end of a time when one single power ran the show for centuries. We tend to think of it as the moment that sent Europe spinning into the Dark Ages, a chaotic, messy time of backward steps that the modern world had to painfully climb its way out of. The collapse was really a perfect storm of problems from the inside, economic meltdowns and tons of pressure from migrating tribes on the outside. It feels like this one, massive catastrophe. But what if it never happened? What if the Western Roman Empire, against all odds, found its footing and just kept going? What if the very thing we think defined Western civilization, its total collapse and violent rebirth, was just erased from the timeline? For a lot of people, that idea brings up images of a new golden age, a fast track to modernity, maybe even Roman legions walking on the moon. But that's a huge misunderstanding of how empires and progress itself actually work. What if, instead of a utopia, this eternal, unbroken empire created a world stuck in a permanent global rut? A world where the single greatest engine for new ideas, competition, was snuffed out before it even started, and progress was squashed for the sake of stability. This isn't the story of a Roman golden age. This is the story of how an eternal Rome could have created a world without a future. The point of divergence, the last true Roman. To get how our world could be so radically and disastrously different, we need to find a fork in the road, a single moment where history could have zigged instead of zagged. The late Western Roman Empire was basically in a state of managed decline, bleeding territory, money, and soldiers. Emperors were often just puppets, put in place and then tossed aside by powerful Germanic generals who really held the reins. But in the year 457 AD, the army picks a man who is a total throwback, an echo of the great emperors of old, Julius Valerius Maiorianus, or just Majorian. Unlike the shadow emperors before him, Majorian was a legit general, a workhorse of an administrator, and a real reformer who saw the deep rot inside the empire. He fought to get Gaul and Hispania back under imperial control, winning big victories against the Visigoths and Burgundians. He passed laws to stop corrupt tax collectors and to protect ancient monuments from being torn down for spare parts. By all accounts, he was the West's last best hope. In our timeline, his run was cut tragically short. In 461, after a disastrous attempt to get a fleet together to retake the vital province of Africa from the Vandals, an expedition that might have been sabotaged by traitors, Majorian was captured and executed by the same general who put him in power, Ricimer. With his death, the last real chance for the Western Empire to save itself died too. What came next was 15 years of puppet rulers until the final, almost boring removal of the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. But in this timeline, the butterfly flaps its wings. Let's just say Majorian's intelligence network is a little better. He finds out about the plot to sabotage his fleet before it's destroyed. The traitors are executed, and his invasion of Vandal-held Africa, the empire's breadbasket, is a tough, bloody fight but a massive success. With the money and grain from North Africa flowing back to Rome, Majorian is untouchable. He comes back to Italy not as a failure, but as a hero. Ricimer, his backstabbing general, is arrested and executed, breaking the cycle of barbarian kingmakers controlling the throne. Majorian, instead of ruling for just 4 years, reigns for a solid 25, living to an old age and dying in his bed. He uses that time to make his reforms stick, rebuild the Western army with loyal Roman citizens instead of sketchy mercenaries, and lock down the frontiers. And crucially, he sets up a stable dynasty, adopting a competent general as his son to make sure the handover of power is smooth, avoiding the civil wars that had so often wrecked the empire. The Western Roman Empire doesn't collapse in 476. It survives, it holds on, and in doing so, it accidentally condemns the world to 1,000 years of twilight. The unbroken empire. The first 5 centuries. The first few centuries of this renewed Roman Empire aren't about glorious expansion, they're about brutal, grinding consolidation. The West surviving under Majorian's dynasty doesn't magically fix everything. The pressure from migrating tribes on the German and Danube frontiers is still there. But with the tax money from North Africa and a reformed, more loyal army, Rome can actually handle these threats now. Instead of provinces breaking away, groups like the Franks and Goths are either beaten back or settled inside the empire on Roman terms, slowly becoming assimilated citizens over generations, just like the old Italic tribes had centuries before. Gaul and Hispania are brought completely back into line. Britain, though, is probably gone for good. The resources needed to reconquer and hold it are just too much for an empire that's still recovering. But from the south of Scotland to the deserts of Syria, a single unified power remains. Western Europe doesn't break up into a patchwork of brand new kingdoms. There's no kingdom of the Franks that becomes France. There's no Visigothic kingdom to create the foundations of Spain. All those unique cultural and national identities are nipped in the bud. There is only Rome. The people living in Gaul, Hispania and Illyria aren't French, Spanish or Croatian. They're just Roman. The language of government and culture stays Latin. It would change over time, but it wouldn't shatter into the Romance languages we know today. French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian and Romanian just don't happen. Instead, a simplified universal version of late Latin becomes the common tongue for the entire Western world. The political and cultural map of Europe stays unified under one roof. The relationship with the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, turns into a sibling rivalry. With the West strong and stable, the two halves of the empire might scheme and trade. But Justinian's crazy expensive attempt to reconquer Italy in our timeline never happens, because Italy was never lost to begin with. This causes a huge domino effect. Without having to worry about the West, the Eastern Empire can throw all its resources at its main rival, Persia. And when Islam rises in the 7th century, it faces a very different world. Instead of a weakened Byzantium and no Western power, it's up against two strong established Roman states. The lightning-fast Arab conquests of Syria, Egypt and North Africa are probably stopped or at least slowed way down. While Islam would still emerge and spread, its path would be a lot harder, maybe keeping it contained to the Arabian Peninsula for much longer and totally changing the religious map of the world. For the first 500 years after Majorian, the world looks stable and orderly. The great Roman roads are still used and maintained. The aqueducts keep pumping water into the cities. To a citizen of this eternal Rome, it might feel like civilization had been saved from chaos. But just under the surface, a creeping paralysis is taking hold. A world without nations. Political and cultural homogenization. The single biggest effect of Rome's survival is preventing what Stanford historian Walter Scheidel calls competitive fragmentation. In our timeline, the collapse of Rome's monopoly on power was the key event that put Europe on its very unique path. The broken pieces of the empire eventually reformed into hundreds of competing kingdoms, duchies, and city-states. This created a hyper-competitive world where states had to innovate or die. If a ruler didn't like a new idea, the inventor could just pack up and walk to the next kingdom to find someone who would listen. This constant competition between states, and also between the state and other powerful groups like the church or merchants, created a one-of-a-kind incubator for progress. In the world of eternal Rome, that whole setup just doesn't happen. There's only one state, one final authority. Power is locked down at the top. The emperor and the giant imperial bureaucracy are the only bosses. And the goal of this massive empire isn't progress or new ideas, it's stability, order and control. Change is a threat. Dissent gets crushed. An inventor with a radical new idea has no other kingdom to run to. There's only Rome, and Rome isn't interested. Culturally, the world is flat. Sure, there would be regional differences, but that amazing quilt of distinct national cultures that defines modern Europe, it's gone. The Roman state's power to assimilate, which successfully Romanized Gauls and Iberians in ancient times, would just keep on chugging. The unique myths, art and traditions of the Germanic, Slavic and Celtic peoples are either wiped out or absorbed into a single, dominant Roman culture. Think about a world without the soaring Gothic cathedrals of France, which came from a totally new style that broke from Roman rules. Imagine a world without Shakespeare's plays, a product of a uniquely English language and identity. Imagine a world without the Renaissance, an explosion of art and science fueled by the rivalries of Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, cities that, in this timeline, are just ordinary provincial Roman towns. The relationship between church and state is also completely different. In our history, the power vacuum left by the empire's collapse let the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, grow into a powerful, independent authority that crossed national borders. The power struggle between popes and emperors basically was the Middle Ages. In a world where the Western Emperor is still in Rome, the papacy would have likely stayed a tool of the state, much like the patriarchs were for the emperors in Constantinople. There would be no great split between a powerful, independent Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Christianity would be more unified, but it would be a faith that answers to the emperor, lacking the spark and intellectual debate that came from its political independence. This world is orderly, unified and peaceful, at least compared to the constant wars of our own Middle Ages. But it's a sterile peace. It's the peace of a museum, not a lab. This vision of a stagnant world really pushes back against the usual golden age idea. It makes you ask a pretty big question. Is stability always a good thing? So how does this lead to a world stuck in time? Next, we'll get into why the Industrial Revolution would never happen in this world. If you're enjoying this deep dive into alternate history, do us a favor and hit that subscribe and like button. It helps us make more content that makes you rethink the past. The Great Stagnation. The suppression of innovation. The most devastating result of an eternal Roman Empire would be the death of progress in science and technology. A lot of people assume that without the Dark Ages, Roman engineering genius would have just kept going, leading to an early industrial revolution. That gets it completely backward. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about a few smart inventions. It happened because of a unique mix of economic and social conditions that popped up in post-Roman Europe, and especially in 18th century Britain. None of those conditions would exist in a surviving Roman Empire. First, think about what drives innovation. Necessity. The Industrial Revolution in Britain was kicked off by high labour costs, which made it profitable to invent machines that could save labour. In contrast, the Roman economy, even a reformed one, would still rely heavily on slaves or other forms of cheap, forced labour. With a huge population and no real reason, moral or economic, to replace human hands with machines, there's no incentive for inventors to create automation. Why spend a fortune developing a complicated harvesting machine when you have thousands of slaves or serfs to do it for you? There's a famous story about the Emperor Tiberius executing an inventor who created a type of unbreakable glass because he was worried it would make gold and silver worthless. The story is probably fake, but it shows a mindset common in big, conservative empires. New ideas that threaten the way things are seen as dangerous. Second, the fuel for industry was missing. The British Industrial Revolution ran on coal. While the Romans knew about coal, they mostly used wood, which has way less energy. Without the competitive pressure to find better energy sources for factories, there would be no big push for coal mining. No coal means no fuel for the steam engines that powered factories and trains. Hero of Alexandria's Eolipile, a very basic steam engine from the 1st century AD, was just seen as a weird toy for rich people. In a world without economic incentive, it would have stayed a toy. Third, and most importantly, is the roadblock of the empire itself. As Walter Scheidel argues, large single empires are naturally resistant to change. Their main goals are to keep things as they are, collect taxes, and stop rebellions. They aren't built to encourage the kind of disruptive, grassroots innovation that leads to massive change. The fragmented system of Europe, for all its violence, created a marketplace for ideas. Rulers competed for the best minds, the best technologies, and the best economic systems. This polycentric system, as Scheidel calls it, was Europe's secret weapon. In an eternal Rome, there is no competition. There is no escape. The imperial government would be huge, slow, and allergic to change. The ruling class, whose wealth is based on land and old traditions, would have every reason to crush inventions that could empower a new class of merchants or industrialists. Without a rising middle class demanding mass-produced goods and without a political system that allows for new experiments, the spark of industrialization would never catch fire. The world would stay agricultural and pre-industrial. You might see advances in military tech or architecture, Rome's traditional strengths, but the explosive, unstoppable growth of the scientific and industrial revolutions would be impossible. The world of the 19th century wouldn't have steamships and railways, but Roman galleys and Roman roads. The 20th century wouldn't have airplanes and electricity, but maybe fancier aqueducts and even bigger colosseums. The information age would be an impossible fantasy. The world would be trapped in an Iron Age stasis, ruled by a single, unchanging power that traded progress for permanence. Conclusion. So what if Rome never fell? The result wouldn't be some sci-fi civilization of marble and chrome. It would be a global society frozen in time. A world without nations, without capitalism, without the Industrial Revolution, and without the very idea of modernity. A unified world, yes, but one that's missing the creative chaos that pushes humanity forward. Rome's legacy is undeniable. It's baked into our laws, our languages, and our way of life. But maybe the greatest gift the Roman Empire ever gave the world was its own death. Its collapse, as awful as it was for the people who lived through it, was the painful but necessary trigger for the world we have now. It shattered the imperial monopoly on power and, in the violent, competitive and dynamic mess that followed, it lit the fires of innovation that Rome itself would have smothered. The fall of Rome wasn't the end of the ancient world. It was the painful, chaotic, and ultimately necessary birth of our own.